Hi, everyone. So in this presentation, I'd like to present what I think are some of the important geodynamic controls on zinc mineralization in clastic-dominated or CD-type deposits that formed along the ancient passive continental margin of Western North America between the Cambrian and late Devonian. So just as a little caveat, I'm an economic geologist, so I'm by no means an expert in tectonics or geodynamics. So I'd like to thank Sasha for organizing this and the invitation to present in this seminar series, because it's a really great opportunity to get some feedback from a different kind of audience. So just as a brief introduction for why we should be interested in zinc, I'm sure we're all aware of the growing importance of renewable energy technologies and decarbonizing the economy. It's perhaps less well appreciated that there are going to be some major raw materials implications to this. So as an example, we fully expect zinc demand to increase as we ramp up wind energy capacity. So it's really important that we discover large, high-grade deposits to supply these future resources. So as well, the figure on the right just shows the complex sort of interrelationships that exist between parent and daughter metals. So it's important to note that certain zinc deposits also contain a suite of critical metals such as indium and gallium that we will need for other technologies. So our research at GFZ has a strong focus on CD-type deposits. Just bring up my laser pointer, which generally represent our highest grade and tonnage zinc systems. So they're part of a general family of base metal deposits that formed in marine environments. So the schematic diagrams below here basically provide a comparison between the genetic model for volcanogenic massive sulfide deposits, which we'll hear more about during Clifford's talk, and the two contrasting models for CD-type deposits. So whereas these VMS systems represent ancient examples of mid-ocean ridge black smoke vent sites that we find in the modern oceans, there are actually no known modern equivalents for CD-type systems. So this basically means that we're left to studying the terrestrial rock record to try and figure out how these systems form. And so here are the main sort of models for deposit genesis. One that involves the upflow of hydrothermal fluids through this fault-bound feeder vent complex, exhalation of these fluids into a marine environment, into reduced seawater that contains H2S, and then the mineralization basically takes place here as we deposit the host rock as well. So this is known as the SEDEX model. And then there are other models that describe similarly fluid upflow along a fault, but then host rock replacement beneath the seafloor, and this can take place during burial diagenesis or even during orogenesis. So together with the colleagues that I'm just showing on the right-hand side here, we've been working towards refining these genetic models in order to improve our understanding of where these systems are distributed on land. So those models are really sort of deposit scale models that tell us something about the site of ore formation, which is represented here on this schematic figure. But what we'd really like to move towards is a more comprehensive mineral systems models. So mineral systems models basically describe all of the key processes that contribute to ore formation. So this will include where metals are sourced from initially, whether there's, for example, a particular rock unit that is important, what kind of fluids were involved in leaching these metals, over what scale, and how were these fluids then, did they move through the crust? So in the SEDEX model or the CD-type deposit model in general, we're talking about a fault in general here. And then we move towards the site of ore formation, which is the deposit here. And as I said, this is where most of the research has been historically focused, but if we want to understand the full mineral systems model, I think we need to start thinking more carefully about the geodynamic setting, because this really provides a first order framework for linking these key parts of the mineral system. So in this talk, I just want to show a couple of instances where there's a potential linkages between the geodynamic setting and metallogenesis, and we're going to go to the Canadian Cordillera to look at this. So the deposits in the Paleozoic are generally associated with ancient rifted continental margins, and the Selwyn Basin is a classic example of this, where there's a rich history of metallogenesis. So this map on the right-hand side will reappear throughout the talk in different forms, but it basically just shows the the present day location of the Selwyn Basin, along with the adjacent carbonate platform that's in the Mackenzie Mountains now, in the Canadian Cordillera. And these stars just represent the major CD type deposits that are located here. The SEDEX model that I just touched on at the start, this was originally developed from work in the Selwyn Basin. It was developed back in the 1980s and was sort of strongly influenced by studies on modern restricted basins like the Black Sea. So initially, as I mentioned, it was thought that in the SEDEX model, basin restriction was a really important prerequisite to the development of stagnant, sort of anoxic conditions in which sulfide minerals would ultimately be preserved at the seafloor. But we've since sort of revised some of these ideas, and there's a development of more geological and geochemical data that's showing sort of slightly different things. So I'll just start by reviewing what we think we know about basin evolution along the Laurentian margin, just as a sort of a framework for this. So on the left, you see this map again. This time it demarcates the different terrains that make up the Western North American margin. This yellow diamond just represents Laurentia, the ancestral margin of Western North America that formed following the breakup of the Rhodinian supercontinent back in the sort of late Neoproterozoic. And it was this rifting event that resulted in the deposition of coarse-grained synrift clastic rocks of the Windermere supergroup. And we consider these rocks basically to be a potential metal source and also aquifer for the ore fluid. Then as we go into the lower Paleozoic, there was the development of a passive margin, which has been compared to the modern day North Atlantic, just shown in rather simple terms here. And it's the fine-grained siliciclastic units dominated by carbonaceous mudstones that overlie the Windermere supergroup that then form the host rock to the CD-type deposits in the Selwyn Basin. On the left-hand side, you just see the stratigraphic relationship a little bit more clearly, and the comparison between the North Atlantic margin has now been explored in a little bit more detail. So here we've got the Windermere supergroup and its Selwyn Basin equivalent here, which we think is the aquifer. And then in the Cambrian and Ordovician, we've got mineral deposits forming, CD-type deposits forming, and higher up in the late Devonian, which I'll come to shortly, we also have some systems forming. In the center, this is a comparison between the stages of rift evolution in the North Atlantic and the equivalent stages along the Laurentian margin. So in both settings, there are small amounts of magmatic activity associated with low degree partial melts. And so this has basically led to both settings as being characterized as magma pore rifted margins that show evidence of hyperextension. So then I'll just briefly, convergent tectonism then just overtook in the Mesozoic. This is when multiple terrains were accreted, and that's what leaves us with the Cordilleran mountain range that we're familiar with today. But I'm not going to talk about that at all, because it's really what happens during hyperextension potentially that's interesting for the mineral systems model. So yeah, if we just backtrack there slightly, I'd like to touch on a couple of areas where I think recent work on hyperextended margins might be relevant to the mineral systems model. So one of the most important aspects here is the thermal architecture, which really provides the sort of the driver of the system in terms of energy. And from studies on various transects of the North Atlantic margin, we know that crustal hyperextension can result in high geothermal gradients. So this, I think, would represent a setting in which you take the synrift unit, which we consider also to be the aquifer, the ore fluids, and then it then undergoes burial diagenesis at elevated temperatures. And it's this kind of setting that could be important for leaching base metals from the aquifer, because it's really much more effective to do this at elevated temperatures. The other important aspect of the mineral system corresponds with structure. And so this is because, you know, finding a way to get fluids from depth from the aquifer unit into a shallow environment during later stages of burial, basin evolution, where they form a deposit is obviously a key aspect. So a few years ago, it was suggested that asymmetric rifting might have been a key part of the geodynamic story along the Laurentian margin. So here you see the Selwyn Basin being located along a lower plate boundary, and this is often where you get thick sequences of synrift sediments. And in particular, in these settings, you get these transform zones that separate the rift domains, and it was actually suggested that they connected with basement rift structures, which then were reactivated during various stages of basin evolution. And geophysical investigations have now confirmed this. And so we actually see these areas as potentially being sort of pervasive crustal weakness regions at a kind of a regional scale. So basically the model then is, you could imagine having a hot, overpressured synrift aquifer unit that had been confined by the later fine-grained siliciclastic units. And then when that aquifer unit was breached during short-lived periods of extension, you'd expel those hot fluids into shallower parts of the basin where you then formed the mineral deposit. So this ties in quite nicely with some of our previous work in the late Devonian on 2 deposits in the Selwyn Basin. And here is just a summary of some fluid chemistry constraints that we derived from a whole load of geochemical analyses that we produced on samples from the feeder zone of the deposit. So this, remember, this represents the main conduit of fluid upflow. We collected samples like this, which are highly altered and contain sulfide mineralization. We did fluid inclusion analyses, a whole load of laser ablation work, isotopic modeling, and recently I've done some work on sphalerite geothermometry. And the overall picture is one of a hot fluid entering the vent complex that then cools as we move away from this flow conduit. And so we think this is sort of the environment in which the mineral deposit is forming. But the question that kind of falls out of this is how we might get 300-degree fluid of low salinity to within 1 kilometer of the seafloor without there being any sort of evidence of direct magmatic input. So to address this, we looked at developing a numerical model of the late Devonian passive margin. So here I've just shown it in a larger scale context of the lower plate boundary has been constrained by geophysical measurements. We then used it as a framework for testing scenarios in which you take a confined aquifer, subject it to a heat anomaly, and then breach it during a rifting event.
Joe, you have 10 minutes now.
That's good. Actually, onto the final slide. So yeah, given the time constraints, I was only planning to summarize the modeling results here and point you towards a paper we recently published in G-Cubed. Basically, what we found was that it was possible to take a hot zinc-rich fluid of low salinity into shallow parts of the basin and would produce tonnages that are comparable to the size of the Selwyn Basin style deposits that we find there. So overall, I hope I've shown you how different aspects of basin evolution, in particular the structures and heat anomalies that are associated with lower plate boundaries along hyperextended margins, could be important features of the mineral systems model for CD type deposits, at least in the Selwyn Basin. And I think we're quite excited by getting into this sort of part of the literature, because when it comes to georesources in these kinds of settings, from what I've seen, the majority of research has kind of been directed towards hydrocarbons. And I think there's exciting potential here in the context of mineral deposits, at least kind of summarized briefly here. So thanks for your attention. Welcome any questions.
Thanks, Joe. We have plenty of time for questions. If you don't want to type them completely, then just type Q and you get the word. Maybe I start with one question. I'm wondering, now that you mentioned that hyperextended margins are an important ingredient in this story, and we have a lot of data from hydrocarbon exploration, could there be some kind of present-day analog where this is happening now somewhere in the world? And if yes, where would you expect it? Where would you go?
Yeah, so I think the majority of sort of exploration in modern marine environments has really been focused around mid-ocean ridge vent systems. I'm not sure of so much going on in terms of drilling in continental margins and such like. So in theory, yeah, it would be interesting to look at the North Atlantic as an analog. But there's a whole suite of other secular controls on the formation of these systems that we'd have to also consider as well. So I think one of the really important things here is that you have these really thick sequence of synrift clastic sediments of the Windermere Supergroup. It's like 5+ kilometers thick. One of the major unconformities in the geological record, and I think that really represents quite a potentially important metal source. So we'd have to have a look at whether you get such a thick sequence of synrift sediments during the evolution of the North Atlantic, and think about the structures that contributed to that. And then, that might be where we look to target as being a potential analog. But yeah, I don't know how easy it would be then to get money to drill a site like that.
Well, yeah, true. Anybody questions? Oh, Bob Trumley, you raised a hand. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Joe, for the talk. It's great stuff. And I wonder, when we, just in follow up to Sasha's question, there must be lots, there is, that doesn't have to be must be, it's a fact that there's a lot of exploration work by the hydrocarbon industry on continental margins, hyperextensive and non. And those folks have very high resolution seismic, especially data sets. I wonder, from your knowledge of these ore deposits, if you've thought about the sorts of seismic signatures they might have. If you asked industry to look in a particular place in one of these systems, what would be the seismic signal possibly, or potentially maybe electromagnetic, of this sulfide accumulation? Could you recognize them?
That's a good question. That's not my, I have to say, that's not my forte, the geophysics side of things. I know that people in GeoMa have been looking at imaging some of the off-axis hydrothermal systems. I guess it depends how deep we can go and with what kind of resolution. But perhaps I'm not really answering your question.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just sort of a brainstorming thing. I wonder, I mean, how much more dense is the mineralized rock than the non-mineralized rock, for example?
Yeah, so one of the challenges is actually, I didn't show any pictures of the host rock, but often we're dealing with the carbonaceous mudstones that often contain a lot of diagenetic pyrite. So you're dealing with a host rock that already contains high concentrations of a background sulfide mineral. So differentiating between something like that would potentially give you essentially a false positive. And economic mineralization would be one complication. And that's something that we have worked on in some of the Cordilleran deposits, because companies have struggled to kind of differentiate between a large body of diagenetic pyrite and an economic mineral deposit, and the relationship between the two.